Hello and welcome to Creative Cafe Live. My name is Robert and today I want to share with you my editing workflow in Lightroom Classic for an image from my portfolio. First, I'm going to walk you through how I put the image together from a compositional and visual design standpoint, which I think is the core of any meaningful image. And then I'm going to walk you through my adjustments in Lightroom to craft an image that I hope tells a story and shares with the viewer what I saw and what I felt when I made the image. And for me, this is really important to tying it in with composition and visual storytelling, because it's only when you know what you want to say with an image that then your adjustments and your work in Lightroom becomes much more intentional, much more purposeful. And that's the idea behind, at least I hope, the idea behind all of my images, and of course, what I try to share and teach to all of my students. So first I'm going to show you the final image. This is already developed so that we can work our way back from that, but really is to give you a sense of how I structured the image from a visual design standpoint. So you can see that the most striking thing here is this separation between the foreground and the background. And that's the first big structure of the image, so to speak. This is a marsh in the Hudson Valley where I live, and when I first arrived here, there was pretty heavy fog, but it was moving rapidly, and as the fog started to recede into the distance, this beautiful warm light started to come into the foreground here. And the tricky thing with fog is always trying to figure out where you want that fog to be. In other words, it's the transition of fog moving through a scene that I think is most beautiful to capture. Too much fog and everything looks completely shrouded in fog and you can't really make out any details. But if you lose all the fog, then of course we've lost that effect, this transition from a very foggy area to where the fog is cleared. And so this for me felt pretty natural because I like these lines that are moving up into these into the top of the frame here, created by the hills that are in the distance. And that creates a nice sort of repeating pattern that then I can repeat more into the frame as we move down to the bottom. The second thing is that when I first started to think about making this image, I probably was capturing something like that. And it wasn't until I looked a little closer that I saw that I could include these bottom grasses in the image here. And that strengthened the composition from my perspective because it gave me a stronger foreground and it created additional layers in the image that I could use to create more depth and more dimension. And so this layer here with these grasses sticking up, which also create a nice compositional juxtaposition with the water in the background, they give me one layer, and then I've got another layer here. And by layer, I mean not only layers moving up the frame, but moving back into the composition, into the picture. And then I've got this mid layer, and then of course, as I mentioned before, these layers back here. And this area here where you pretty much just have total fog, that also is key for me because that allows me to continue this sense of a gradation, a variation from no fog here, and then we get more and more and more fog until we get into the distance. And again, that creates more depth and more dimension and leaves a little bit of mystery here for the viewer. Another interesting thing that I had to sort of deal with was this tree here, and there's another one here and another one here. And those three trees together create this group. And because they create a group, then the fact that the one in the center is in the middle isn't really a problem. If there was only this tree, if that's all there had been in this scene, then I definitely would not have placed that tree in the center because that would have placed it right in the middle and made the image a little too symmetrical and also would have drawn a lot of attention to that one unique shape. But because I've got other shapes that combine with it, then that creates more of a pattern, not one singular shape, and that pattern allows the viewer to continue to move past this area and back into the image. And then finally, the other thing that I think works really well is the water here. And notice that I let the water come over to this side and then it continues that way. And this is a question of moving my camera left and right to get this water kind of on a third on this side, and then there's another area here that's kind of on a third. And so this zigzag motion here creates some nice S-curves through the image. And anytime you can create a sense of movement in terms of curves, that's always going to make your image more dynamic versus a static image. If that had been moving, let's say the water had been moving front and back, I always try to change my perspective to create a sense of movement diagonally and particularly along curves. That always helps to make your image as dynamic and as interesting as possible. So that's the idea behind the capture of the image. Now I'm going to jump into Lightroom and let me walk you through how I went about editing the image. So here you see the original image. This is the raw file without any processing. And the first thing you'll notice, I think you'll notice, is that this little tree here, a few little branches here kind of crept into the right side of the frame. I don't think I noticed those when I was originally capturing the image, but that's something that you definitely want to avoid because that's a distraction. It's sort of moving into the side of the frame and it really shouldn't be there. And so we can get rid of that pretty easily in the develop module by pressing Q. You just clear this panel here on the left. I'm going to press Q and close that panel. There we go. And using the generative AI, I'm going to just create a selection around that branch. Something like that. Make sure you have generative AI checked, and then I'm going to click on remove. And this should be pretty easy for Lightroom to clear up for us. And you can see that it did a pretty nice job there getting rid of that branch on the right. Next, I'm going to come over to the basic panel. And for me, the basic panel is really important because it does a lot of work for an image. It really helps to get your image into the ballpark. It establishes kind of the feel and the mood that you want for an image because the basic panel really allows you to do the most amount of adjustment to the tones and the color of the image. Everything else that comes after that is going to be an add-on. It's kind of a way to supplement what's going on in the basic panel. But this really does a lot of the heavy lifting. So I'm going to first, I think, warm up the image a little bit. This helps to really bring out the radiance of the light on these grasses here, and you can see how it adds a little glow to the fog in the distance. We'll check my exposure. I think about there, make it a little bit brighter. Again, exposure is midtones, so you want those midtones to be nice and open so the image feels like it has lots of luminosity. I'm going to pull that on the highlights a little bit. Push up on the shadows. Maybe about there. Then I'll check my whites. I'm going to hold on the Option key to bring up the overlay, and that's clipping the sky there. So come back a little bit. Actually, I'm going to go a little further than that. We can always address the sky here with a mask later for this background area, but I'm going higher in the whites because I really like the way it makes the foreground glow with that color. And as long as we're not clipping anything in the foreground, I can address the sky later on. Then I'm going to adjust my blacks, hold on my Option key, see where I'm clipping. Right there we start to clip. So I'm going to let go of the Option key, Alt on the PC, and I'll stop around there. And blacks gives us our depth to the image. That sets the blackest point of the image, which are these shadows here in the grasses. And there really isn't much detail there, so I don't have to worry about losing anything there. As long as we're not losing any place that I want detail to remain, then I'm free to push that black slider as low as I want. And of course, always double check things with your eyes. In other words, look at the image, see what the effect is doing and see if you're happy with the way the image looks. Regardless of what our histogram is telling us, it has to look good to us. Okay, I'm definitely going to use some texture here because that will bring out a lot of this wonderful texture in the foreground. You can see what that does here to these grasses. Really brings out the detail there. I'll add some clarity as well. Not too high in the clarity. The clarity tends to take away the effect of fog and the mystery that an image can have because of things like fog in the background. So maybe 10 or 11 is fine there. I'm also going to use a touch of dehaze. Maybe something like that. And that just helps to give us a little more dimension in the background, again, without removing that feeling of fog. I'll add some vibrance to bring in some more color. And that's starting to look pretty good. So let's look at our before and our after. So once again, the before, and there's our after. Let's come down to detail. And here I'm going to add some sharpening. So I'll bring my sharpening up to about maybe 60. By the way, a mistake I just made there. You always want to zoom in when you're sharpening because it allows you to see the effects of the sharpening much better. So I would say something like that. Particularly these grasses here is where I have the most amount of definition. So again, here it was at 40. I'm going to bring this up to about 60. I'm going to keep the radius low because a low radius means that we are going to sharpen very fine edges. The low radius lets Lightroom search for and sharpen very fine edges that are close to each other. And so that's definitely what we want. Whenever we use a low radius, we can use the detail slider, which is, you can think of it as a micro enhancement. It enhances micro edges. And then the magic tool that I love, which is the masking slider. What the masking slider enables us to do is to add some aesthetic sharpening. And that means that we can add sharpening, or we can have sharpening where it matters, the foreground and the grasses, and less sharpening and remove the sharpening entirely where it doesn't really matter or where we don't really need it, like the water and particularly this foggy area back here. So I'm going to hold down the Option key, Alt on the PC, click and hold the mouse button down and push this masking slider up, and you see that it creates a mask on the fly. And anywhere in white means that we're still getting the sharpening, but areas in black are being protected from the sharpening. And that's what I mean by aesthetic sharpening. Because we are sharpening the foreground, but not sharpening the background, then that creates a stronger sense of depth in the image because our eyes are more attracted to areas that are sharp versus areas that are not. And that again creates more dimensionality in your image. There's no point in sharpening everything in the image. That really just raises the volume of everything. And I want the volume of the foreground to be a little stronger than the volume in the background. Okay, so let's look at our before and after. And so you can see the image now is taking on a very painterly look. And that's because of the light, the warmth that I added with the temperature adjustment, and also maintaining that fog in the background, not adding too much dehaze, not adding too much clarity, because again, that tends to remove some of that softness that's in the back. Okay, one thing I would like to do though is perhaps cool off the background just a little bit to create more depth. That's because our foreground is very warm because of the warm light, but I'd like to make a little more separation. And we can do that by using the juxtaposition of warm to cool that creates separation. So I'm going to click here on the local adjustments. Then I'm going to click on linear gradient, and I'm just going to drag a linear gradient down like so. And I like the linear gradient because it creates this nice transition from where the effect is to no effect. And here I'm going to pull down a tiny bit on highlights. Maybe something like that. And then here's the temperature adjustment where I'm going to just cool this part of the image off just a little bit. And I'm going to about -5. And that's really all I need. Now you can see there's a little more of a transition, a gradation between where the light is and the shadows on the right side. A little cooler on this side, a little warmer on that side. Again, that just creates more depth and more dimension, particularly when you take into account that we're starting in warm here and then cool and then back to warm again where the light is. So that's our before and that's our after. And I will also show you the mask here without that mask or linear gradient and with that linear gradient. Okay, that for me really makes a nice difference, gradation between the foreground and the background. I'm going to create another mask and select the brush. And we'll make this brush a little bigger and raise the flow up to 100. And this will be a dodging brush. So I'm going to set the exposure to 0.30. And I'm just going to use this to add some highlights to some of these grasses here. Again, just to emphasize that beautiful light. Maybe a little bit over here. Maybe here. I'm going to press 5 or 6, actually 6 on my keyboard to lower the flow to 60. That means that this effect will now be applied at 60% of its original strength, because I want this to be a little lighter back here. By lighter, I mean I want the effect to be less strong than it is over here. And I'll even add it down in here a few spots, like right in here, where you can see more of that light sort of hitting the fronts of these grasses. I'm going to raise the flow back up to 80, maybe 90%, just to make the brush again a little stronger. And then here in the foreground, 100%, and just add some little accents here. Something like that. So that's my mask. This is a dodging mask to brighten those areas, give them some sparkle, give them some a stronger sense of light. I'll also come over here to this tree and maybe just touch the side of that tree there, and same thing over here, just to create a little more dimension for that tree. Then I'm going to create another mask. This will be another brush, but this time I'm going to lower the exposure to -30. And now add some depth. So I'm going to press 7 on my keyboard just to lower the flow a little bit, because I don't want this back here to be that dark. Maybe in here. But as I come forward, I'm going to lower the flow now to 100% so that I can get a stronger darkening here, which is some shadows. And these shadows, you can see, create a lot more dimension and depth in the foreground. Something like that, and then maybe in here as well. And what I'm looking for is some of these darker areas. So you notice this is a little lighter because it seems to be a little more open to the sunlight. This side over here is in shadow, so that's what I'm darkening. I'm looking for and using the natural light that already exists in the image to emphasize the depth and dimension of the picture. Because of course, a picture is a representation, right, of an actual three-dimensional scene, and so dodging and burning helps to recreate the illusion of depth, which a picture is an illusion. It's not the real thing. But I want to bring the viewer into this space and feel kind of the space and the depth of the scene, particularly as, again, the fog was moving through the picture. Or through the scene, I should say. And I think that about does it. Now I'm going to come back to my basic adjustments and just double check my whites. I could probably go a little bit higher here. Now I can go a little higher because we did apply that mask to that linear gradient to the sky. And I'll check my blacks here, maybe a tiny bit less, something like that. And then I think just to finish off the image, I'll just add a touch of contrast here. Lots of times students will ask me when I use or when to use this contrast slider versus something more powerful like the tone curve. And the answer for me usually is if I'm looking just to add some overall basic contrast like I am now, then this is fine. I can just add some contrast overall. I'm not looking to add specific contrast, or I'm not looking to add more depth without affecting the highlights. Just good old basic contrast is fine. But if I need more control, particularly control between the highlights and the shadows, then I'll use the tone curve. In this case, I think the basic contrast is fine. So that's our before, and that's our after. And I'm going to press the Y key on my keyboard to show you before and after side by side. And you can see how we have accentuated the sense of depth between the foreground and the background. The light really feels energetic in the foreground and really feels like it's permeating the entire image, but we maintain some of these shadow areas to create more variation so that it's not completely warm in the background. You see this gradation from warm to a little bit of coolness and then warm again in the foreground. If you enjoyed this demonstration, then tune in every Sunday. I'm live streaming at 2 p.m. and I'll be sharing other workflows and other Lightroom tips. And I'm also going to be offering image critiques on images that you can submit. If you subscribe to my newsletter, which you can find in the description, then you'll get information on submitting your image. And if I choose one of your images, I will do a critique on a live stream similar to what I've done here today. The only stipulation is you only get one critique for a lifetime. So once you get selected, then you can't submit another image, or I won't select your image again. But if you would like more regular critiques and you would like regular feedback as well as other creative resources, then of course you can always check out the Creative Path Academy, where I share these kinds of tips and ideas and many other things to help you become a better visual storyteller. Thanks again for watching. See you next time.